Hello, my name is Tony Bell. I'm a local preacher and I'm speaking to you from a bedroom in my house in Lower Earley, which is close to Reading. It's a lovely day and the sun has just come out. I've brought up a couple of things which are usually in our lounge downstairs. Over on that side is a picture I quite like, and over on the other side is a lampstand of Nigerian origins that was given to us by my uncle when we got married in 1975. I bring these partly for ornamentation so that you're not staring at a blank white wall behind me, but also for distraction if you need a little bit of distraction as we go along. As I sit here, I'm looking at my computer screen. I can see a picture of myself, the same picture that you're seeing. I'd much rather be looking at you. I find it so important in preaching for it to be a two-way thing between the preacher and the congregation. But there we are. That's the situation. In actual fact, I spend quite a lot of time in this kind of situation looking at a screen. I work from home and I do quite a few Zoom meetings, and I guess many of you have had the Zoom experience where a picture of everybody appears on the screen with a camera showing what they're doing. And what I find particularly disconcerting is having a picture of myself up there all the time as one of the members of the meeting. And I must admit that my attention does stray to the picture of myself. I know very well I should be paying attention to everybody else in the meeting and listening carefully, but I can't help looking at myself and wondering, for instance, does my hair need cutting? And as you can see, yes it does. It's about time to get the clippers out. Well, I mention this by way of introduction because I find that my relationship with God goes in a similar kind of direction, and I guess I'm not the only one. I have a tendency to pay attention to myself when I should be paying attention to God. Even in the Christian relationship aspects of my life, I tend to start with myself. Oh, are my prayers good enough? Am I doing enough good works? Am I reading the Bible? All sorts of things like that, which are of course important in their own way. And when we go to church, we usually have a time of self-examination and confession, and then we bring prayers for ourselves as well as for others towards the end of the service, and so we should. But when it comes to our relationship with God, it really starts at the other end. It's about God's love for us, which is far greater than our love for God. And this has come home to me recently, something I've been thinking of. It's struck me really how much God knows me, and that God knows me totally and fully and completely. I tend to enjoy asking questions like, how do I know there is a God? Or how do I know what I do know about God? But these questions about me knowing God pale into insignificance compared with God knowing me. During lockdown, I spend a lot of time not only in Zoom meetings, but also, especially in my spare time, looking at my Kindle, which, as many of you will know, is a tablet designed by Amazon for reading books, but I use it for a lot more. I do my emails on it, and I look at the news, and so a lot of my life feeds through a computer screen or a little Kindle, and it can be very frustrating. When I read the newspapers on my Kindle, I find that the screen fills up with adverts so that I can hardly read the news underneath the adverts. And when I log on first thing, it gives me some adverts which are tailored to my needs, suggesting what I might like to spend my money on. Well, as it happens, my wife and I have a shared Amazon account, and this seems to confuse Amazon, which actually gives me pleasure. So they think we're an amalgam of the two of us, and so I'm getting adverts for books I don't read and for clothing which quite frankly would not fit my body. But it's all rather worrying, this amount that the computers in the cloud seem to know about me. They seem to know details of my life which really surprise me. But much though the computers in the cloud know about me, they don't know about me personally as a person. Even less do they care about me. And sometimes I have to remind myself that there's no person up there in the cloud watching me on a computer and making decisions. It's all done totally automatically. The computer does it. And well, I'm glad really. I wouldn't want somebody to be watching me to that level of detail. But there we are. That's the computers in the cloud give a good appearance of knowing me fully. But although they may know me fully, they don't know me in the way that God knows me. And there are many places in the Bible where it tells us how much God knows us totally and deeply. And it's a completely different way from the way the computers in the cloud know me. If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that's Paul's great chapter on love. It connects being loved with being known fully. One cannot love completely a person that one doesn't know fully. And part of God's loving for me is that he knows me fully. At the end of that chapter, Paul writes, "Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." And that verse and others like it have stuck in my mind recently. And I could have chosen 1 Corinthians 13 for one of the readings today. But it's a bit over familiar and we tend to sort of let it gloss by without sort of really noticing it, thinking, oh, I know that already. And another verse has struck me recently which says a similar thing. And it comes from Paul's letter to the Galatians. Now the context of chapter 4, which we did hear, part of it anyway, read to us, was Paul writing to the church in Galatia, reminding that they are no longer slaves to the law and should not live like that. Instead, they are children of God who can address God as Abba, Father. Paul writes, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not God's. But now that you are known by God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back?" Paul starts that second sentence by saying, "Now that you know God," and then he stops and he thinks and he corrects himself and he sees it from the other end and he writes as well, or rather are known by God. It's like being on Zoom. Paul, as he wrote this letter, at one moment his eyes were on himself, and then he thinks, no, it's really about God's eyes being on us. And this means actually more to me than the reading verse from 1 Corinthians 13. In that chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, it's as though Paul has written it all, thought it all out in advance, and it's a beautifully constructed chapter about love. But when he writes to the Galatians, I feel it's more spontaneous, and it's the real Paul coming through, It reveals Paul as a man before God, and it speaks of the human condition. And Paul, as we see, also needs to remind himself that God's love is the source of the relationship between God and us. We are saved and healed because God knows us and loves us. In the Gospel reading, we see a similar message, but it comes through rather differently. That is an early chapter of John's Gospel, right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. There's a long way to go to the cross, and certainly those new disciples had no idea what they were letting themselves in for. But even at that very first meeting between Jesus and his new disciples, he knows them. He sees them as they are. He sees their potential and what they will become even beyond the resurrection. So Jesus meets Simon for the first time and immediately renames him as Peter, the rock on which Jesus says he will build his church. Already Jesus saw in Peter what he was and what he would become. And then there's this little cameo role for Nathaniel, who doesn't appear very often, but it's a lovely little section, this. As Nathaniel is being brought to Jesus for the first time, they meet for the first time, Jesus sees him and says, "Aha, here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." And poor old Nathaniel is totally astounded. "How do you know me?" he says. But Jesus did know him, and he could see him, and he could see to his heart straight off at that moment. And throughout the Gospels you get the same. You get Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman at the well, and he already knows so much about her. He says to her, "You've had 5 husbands." And a story well known to all of us that I like is the story of Jesus meeting Zacchaeus, the little man who went up a tree so that he could see Jesus coming by. And there must have been crowds of people around. Jesus looks up into the tree and he says, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." There was this chief tax collector, hated by many actually. But Jesus sees him, picks him out of the crowd, and says something which indicates that Jesus knows he is ready for his life to turn around. And indeed it does when Jesus goes to his house and eats there. And there are many times when this happens in the Gospels. We read, for instance, Jesus knew in his spirit what they were thinking in their hearts. I imagine it must have been very unnerving to meet Jesus, to be seen and to be understood straight off. It's extraordinary. Leaves nowhere to hide. Jesus knows it all, good and bad. But it's where our healing and our salvation begins, in being known and being loved for who we are. And God sees us, and Jesus saw people and knew what was going on. Returning to Paul's letter to the Galatians. He talks about this new life of being fully known and pictured it as being a child of God, addressing God as Abba, Father. Abba, a word of intimacy and trust. It's often said that it's how a young child addresses their father. But to be a child of God is not a matter of being childish, and it applies to all of us at all ages, all times in our lives. And this same phrase, Abba, Father, is also used in other places. Jesus actually used it in his great prayer in Gethsemane, or just before his arrest. He prays to God, Abba, Father. So Abba Father embraces mature relationship as well as childlike relationship, and it embraces our times of challenge as well as our times of peace and comfort. It's a parent-child relationship with God, but as we know, many of us, child-parent relationships, whether from the child point of view or the parent point of view, have many ups and downs. Toddlers have tantrums, adolescence can be quite turbulent, and even adult relationships with our parents or with our children can be quite difficult. Usually they are joyful, but not at all times, and sometimes it can become too difficult and people have to distance themselves. But however it turns out, we cannot walk away emotionally from the close members of our family. Whatever happens, the love remains. And such and more is God's love for us. The prophet Isaiah puts it very well. He writes, "Can a mother forget her baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands." And this is a measure of the love that sent Jesus to the cross. He did it for us out of love. So, God fully knows us, but it's not like a computer in a cloud accumulating information about us, using cookies and using them to manipulate our spending in purposes which are not for our benefit. God's full knowledge of us is far more complete than any knowledge of a computer in the cloud, because it sees to us personally who we are at our very depths. And this love goes to such depth that we can go into this Abba Father relationship. God watching over us not to manipulate us and use us, but watching over us because he loves us and he wants us to find health and salvation and to learn to love him and to learn to understand the depth of how much there is love for us. All this is in God's nature, and God can do no other.